In church governance, there are three kinds of governing documents. There's a constitution, there are bylaws, there are policies, which are individual policies kept in a book of policies. These are not the same thing as your articles of incorporation, which are between you and the government and require periodic renewal and fees to be paid. But today what we're going to talk about is constitutions, bylaws, and policies. The reason many congregations in the past wrote these documents all intermingled with each other. The problem with that is that you want things that are hard to change in your constitution, easier to change in your bylaws, and things that are board matters that can change with the times in your policies, so that you don't have to have congregational meetings to change your document, your big, huge document with everything in it. So you want to have three kinds of documents, and we'll go about talking about what's in each of them. Congregations generally have four kinds of governing bodies: the congregation itself, the board of elected leaders, an executive committee of, sometimes, not all, but most congregations have a smaller group of officers and maybe a couple members at large, and trustees. Some congregations also have a governing role for their elders, and that is the older style of disciples leadership. Since about the 70s or 80s, most congregations have gone to a board, with elders moving into pastoral care and spiritual formation of the congregation. A congregation is the body that adopts the budget. It elects the officers. It has the ultimate vote on hiring pastoral staff, not other staff, but pastoral staff. And when there are changes to the Constitution, your congregation will make those choices. For other choices and other kinds of decisions, there are other bodies, but these are generally what congregations do and vote on. Your board has, there are 10 to 12 things that, in Oregon at least, and I believe in most states there's a variation of this, they have required functions of nonprofit boards. Those do apply to your congregation. The main role of a board is to make sure that the stated purpose of the congregation is accomplished by the staff, that you have a purpose and that your staff is not saying, you know, our purpose is X. So now your staff is saying, well, we're also going to I've seen this before, we're going to put a school in the building, we're going to do all these things, but if they don't align with your purpose, your board should be saying, is this in our purpose? Having a school can be within your purpose if it's written that way, but the board is responsible. For instance, one of them had a coffee shop, and they rented that part of their building to a coffee shop, which turned out to be a problem because it was a for-profit business in a nonprofit space and they were penalized for it. But you need to make sure that your purpose is what the board is always asking. Your board also makes sure that the resources of your congregation are used for that stated purpose. So your board also hires and creates supervisory structures for your pastor. So that means that because the pastor is responsible to the board, they would make reports of their work to the board. They would have a supervisory structure based on the board. And then there would be a personnel committee elected to supervise other staff. You don't have the board supervising the day-to-day staff, because that's not the role of a board. That's the role of the personnel committee of the board. Your board should be fully informed in the program life of your church. And so during meetings, before meetings, after meetings, your board should get mailings that say, these are the things that our congregation is doing, so that if somebody asks the board member about something, they're not blindsided. You want your board members to be informed. It is also legally true in Oregon that the board needs to be responsible to see that suitable financial controls are in place, that money is accounted for in appropriate ways. We have policies on financial management, which we'll talk about later in the policy section. Todd Adams, who taught me a lot about what I know on this topic, said something I've never forgotten in a presentation, which is, trust is not a financial control. Let that sit there for a minute. Trust is not a financial control. Just because somebody in the congregation is trusted, they still should not count the money, bank the money, write all the checks, and sign the checks. That's not a financial control, even if you trust that person a lot. You need to have financial controls in place, and the place where that is, the people responsible to make sure that happens is the board. You also want to make sure that the board knows that any legal reports to government agencies, renewal of articles of incorporation, taxes for any part of the building that is taxed. I know in Medford, they have this little place where a cell phone tower is, and that little piece of land where that sits is a taxable piece of land because it's for-profit company that is renting that space. So you need to make sure that those taxes are filed, and the board needs to be aware of what they are and if they're done. Your board also establishes a review schedule for the policies of the congregation. So when we get to policies, each policy at the end of it should say, this policy will be reviewed every X number of years, so that you don't get into the situation where many congregations find themselves, which is that your policies, your documents are out of date and they don't have an automatic renewal trigger. And so it just doesn't get done. And I just recently did a set of documents for a congregation that had not renewed their documents for 18 years. And it was a lot harder to do than if they'd only done it a few years ago, which is why we're having this conversation. A board also is the final court of appeals if there's a staffing matter that does not get resolved in normal personnel policy processes and there's an appeal process. The board would be the final court of appeal in accordance with your personnel policy and your policy manual. Each congregation does this a little bit differently, but there are best practices I can help you with. Also, boards are responsible to keep a permanent file of minutes. You need to make sure that your congregation has a book of minutes. If you don't have that, this would be a good time to gather up as many minutes as you can find and stick them in a book. We have found, we're not doing it on purpose to get behind on that. It's just they reside all over the place and they need to be in one place. So those are the responsibilities of a board. Now, an executive committee, which many of our congregations have, they call it different things, but that's where the key officers, as well as maybe sometimes a person who is a person at large. Our regional board has the officers on the executive committee, plus 2 at-large members from the board to make sure that decisions get made between meetings that need to be made. An executive committee cannot act instead of your board on anything that they're not asked to do. Most times when an executive committee is asked to make a decision at the previous board meeting, like they're receiving bids for something, and they say, we are receiving bids, and the board will say, well, our next board meeting isn't for 2 or 3 months, and we want that porch fixed before the next board meeting. So we vote to authorize the executive committee to get bids and accept a bid. So something like that. You don't ask the executive committee to freelance, and any decision the executive committee does make needs to be then reported to the next board meeting. This makes it nimble for congregations whose boards meet less often or have decisions that come up. And this committee often meets with the pastor on a regular basis, more frequently than with the board. Most congregations also have trustees. Trustees usually are 3 to 5 members, depending on the congregation, and they are the ones that exercise the financial responsibility for investments, contracts, insurance, major property issues, and endowment funds. The trustees also make recommendations to the board about matters in the areas listed above. So they may come to the board and say, most of their decisions will come to the board for ratification, but they are given responsibility depending on how much responsibility your congregation gives them. Some congregations have different committees for endowments, and it's not the trustees, or they have different, there's a property committee that makes recommendations, but and then others, what they do is they have anything over a certain amount has to go to the trustees. So like the property committee can make decisions up to $1,000 or things that fit within the budget, but they can't do extra budget things without the trustees, because those are the body of the financial accountability with outside the church systems. So the role of these documents that we're going to talk about is to assist your governing bodies to have instructions for how to operate, how to do things fairly and legally, and not by the seat of our pants. And also it's important to have these rules so that if it were ever to happen in any of our congregations, who knows, it might happen that we had a conflict. You know, it happens sometimes, but when you have a conflict, these documents become essential because these are the things that keep it from going crazy. And this is the way that when people get into a disagreement space, they have a method for solving that because there are boundaries around what people will and won't do. And that helps it to be so that little groups of people can't obligate the church for something big. We've had several occasions where a small group in the congregation decided for the good of the congregation to do something, signed a legal document to do it without checking with people because they were just trying to help. But that obligated the congregation to things that they couldn't afford. So we need to have ideas about how our governing systems work that we all agree on. It's a covenant. And the other thing this does is if you ever were to be sued, and that does happen in the world now, we are more and more a litigious culture. They will ask for your governing documents and they will want to know that you follow them. And so what's important is if you are out of sync and operating outside of what your documents are, you are at some risk, which is the other reason this work is important. And also you need these documents in place so that your assets do not get stolen. So this is what is in a constitution. And this is why we divide the pieces of constitution, bylaws, and policies so that just these things are in your constitution, because you make it really hard to change it so that this is one of your protections against your assets being stolen. In the beginning, you would have a preamble describing your identity. This is not the place to tell me everything you think about Jesus and God in the Bible. This is not a theological document. Remember, this is a legal document. Name of your congregation, your legal name, that should match your articles of incorporation, and the purpose of your congregation in 1 to 3 sentences. That's all it needs to be, because you want to make sure that your board then is keeping you aligned with this purpose. Again, your theological documents can be in faith statements. They can be on your website of this is what we believe. They can be everywhere else, but they don't belong in your legal document, because the only people who are going to ever read this are you and lawyers. So, and you don't want to change it every time you want to change that. You want to have open theological discussion. Membership of the organization is in your constitution. Who is a member of your congregation and who is not? That becomes important in legal matters about who can vote on things. This is a hot topic in a lot of congregations who will say, but we have 1/3 to 1/4 of our congregation that is part of us, but they never joined. We can all do that. We can rejoice, and people all have reasons to not join a church, and you can name them as well as I do. However, when it comes to legal matters, you need to know who can and cannot vote as a constituted member of the congregation. It doesn't mean that people who choose not to do that are lesser than in your community, but for legal purposes, you need to define membership. And I can help you with that. I've helped 3 or 4 congregations to do it 3 or 4 different ways. And there are ways to do this that doesn't feel awkward to me. You also in your constitution want to say who has authority, what is the authority and responsibilities of the congregation. This is where you would lay out that the congregation elects the officers, passes the budget, hires, that's where you list that. You also want to say what the board and committees are to do, but you don't say they meet this often, this is how many people they have, this is how many committees we have, this is what they're named. You don't put all that there. You just say, our board can make decisions in these areas, but that's a bullet list. It's not essay question. The other thing is how officers are elected. It's not all the mechanics of how do you get a nominating committee and all that. That goes in the bylaws. But here it says we will have a president who does this, a vice president who does this. It should be a sentence. And then your favorite sentence in the Constitution, my favorite sentence is, as outlined in the most currently board adopted bylaws. So that you don't have to change this all the time, because you can change the bylaws. But what you will do is you will say a sentence about each office, and then you will refer people to your bylaws. The congregational meeting, so we'll say what can go to the congregation with a minimum number of meetings per year. Not that they're the first Friday of December or whatever, first Sunday of December to do this, because if something happens to that first Sunday of December and you can't meet then you're out of compliance. And so then if you're asked, did you vote on that day on this thing? You can't say yes. but your constitution said you had to do it. So you take the meeting dates out, but you put a minimum number, usually one, with a provision to call extra meetings as listed in the most currently board adopted bylaws. You don't, like I said, name the date. Finally, in your constitution, it tells how you hire pastoral staff, how you release a pastoral staff person from employment. Please have your regional minister involved in that at all times and in the hiring. That if a pastor decides to either retire or resign to go to another call or a secular job, you need a process to receive the resignation. You don't vote on a resignation, because if they resign, they've resigned. You can't talk them out of it with a vote. So you need to have a policy, and those I can give you boilerplate for. You also want a relationship of the pastor to the board. In very broad strokes, this is not a job description. This doesn't say what the pastor does. That goes in a job description. But what this says is the pastor is a spiritual leader of the congregation and is responsible to the congregational board. And that's all. You don't say what else they do. You say who they are, title them, and then who they're responsible to. And everything else goes in your personnel policy and your bylaws. And you also confirm in your constitution that the regional church will assist you in pastoral change. And that is because one of the ways that people get their assets stolen is they have a friend named George who has a cousin named Fred who always wanted to be a pastor, has no training, but he'd sure come cheap. If you do that, you put yourself at risk, because about half the time that people do that, within a year or two, their assets are gone to somewhere else. And so it doesn't mean you can't hire people outside of the disciples process, but have your regional staff help you do that in a way that protects you. You also want to put in there, the thing that people don't like is what rules of order will be followed. Robert's Rules of Order, most recent edition, is good. It is not an onerous, terrible process like people think it is. You need to have some rules of engagement. There are several other kinds of rules of engagement, but I have found in reading them and trying to figure out how they work that Robert's rules are still more fair. It doesn't mean you can't have consensus. It doesn't mean you can't practice other ways of making decisions. But when you get to a board decision, you may take a discernment process and say, this committee on discernment comes to you with this recommendation. And you can do everything you want, but at the end, you need in your minutes that somebody moved, somebody seconded, and it was adopted. And if it's a split vote, what that was. So, but there is there's lots of intricacies, but the basic Robert's rules are not that hard to do. The other thing you want in your constitution, an indemnification statement for board members, which means if you do get sued, et cetera, this is the protection your board members have. Because if you don't have this, in this culture now, sometimes people have been known to go after the board members after something that they're suing the church for. This is a way to keep your board members from getting their own personal assets hooked up into a lawsuit. So let's give you some information about how to put that in your constitution. You also want to say in your constitution what you can amend in the constitution, how to do it, and what part of your constitution cannot be amended. And that is for your protection of your assets. Because the other thing that goes in your constitution is if for any reason you were to dissolve, this is what it would take to dissolve a congregation, and this is where the assets would go upon closure. You don't want the way that people get their assets stolen is somebody joins the church, brings 25 or 30 friends. There's one going on in California right now like this. It was a small church, about 30 people joined. They were all excited. They voted to not be disciples anymore, and they also voted to sell the building and give the money somewhere. And the long-term people, this congregation of well over 100 years, their assets were gone within a couple of months. So you need to make the distribution of assets upon closure something that doesn't change, so that the understanding of the congregation is, this is what would happen in that case. And I was asked once, if we close and we sell the church, do we get to split the money? The answer is no, that's illegal. Is you also don't want to be able to amend, how to amend the Constitution. So there are 3 places in your Constitution you should not have amendments possible. And we'll walk through that later, but that's just an overview. Your distribution of assets, many people think, well, it's in our Constitution where we want our money to go. The problem with that is if it is not filed with your county, with the property tax people of your county, it is not binding. So, but you could say, but it's in our minutes. If you remember where the minutes are and you remember what meeting it was, yay. Most people won't at that point. And so you need to have filed it when you're fine and you're not ready to dissolve, so that you can go to the county and do that. There was in the bylaws, you put the titles and the terms of service and qualifications for your officers. This is not a place to put lots and lots of details, but you will say, this is the president of the congregation. They preside at board meetings and blah, blah, blah. They serve here ex officio, blah. You know, that kind of couple of sentences, bullet points. And you generally say, now, and some congregations do this differently than others. Some of them say, needs to be a member of the congregation, an official member of the congregation. Others say an active participant in the congregation. But remember that members can vote, and a participant is not a voter, but you can have them as an officer if it's in your bylaws that that's okay, but you have to remember they can't vote. That's awkward, but it's kind of how it is legally. You'd say, what is the makeup of your board? What is a quorum? How many people need to be present to make decisions? A minimum number of meetings a year, not we meet on the third Wednesdays, because if you then have to change the meeting, and you don't need to meet if you don't have business to do. Here's a little known fact in church life. Just because a meeting's set, you don't have to have that meeting if you don't have an urgent reason to have it. You also have how to call a meeting in between meetings if you need to. It is generally thought that a quorum needs to be at least a third of the membership of the board or more. I like it to be half or more. Some congregations prefer to have it a third, but less than a third is not okay in best practices. Voting by proxy is not allowed. If you cannot come, you cannot vote. And the reason for that is the reason that you have that in there is that if somebody votes and then there's new information that comes out in the discussion, they don't have the value of that discussion, and they may not vote the same way. They can be on the phone, they can be online in real time and vote, but they cannot call in a vote, especially, and this is why you want that, because during a very controversial thing, you might have people calling a bunch of disaffected members who never got off the membership rolls, but they're really mad about something. They never go to church, but they are still members, so they can still vote, but they don't want to come to the meeting, but they want to vote. And somebody who wants to pad the vote with people that they know might be cranky about this topic or upset, they can say, well, I've got all these proxy votes that feel this way. That's not okay, actually. You can't do that. But you can have people online and on the phone in real time. During COVID, we have tested this, and we've had people say, well, we just sent out a note and had people vote online. That's not actually, unless there is no discussion at all and it's a yes, no question. And but if there's any opportunity to discuss it between the initial vote time and the vote itself, that's not actually okay to do. You need to have in your bylaws, what are the roles of the elders, trustees, and the diaconate? Not how often they meet, but what are their jobs? You also want to have the overall rules for congregational meetings. What percentage do you need to have a quorum, or is it whoever shows up is the quorum, which is how some do it? You need to have a minimum number of meetings. I usually think one, and then a process about how to call a meeting. Some congregations actually meet 4 times a year, and they have reasons for doing that. But I like to say one with a possibility of more, because that way, if you don't need to have a meeting, you're not in violation of your rules. The scope of pastoral authority and how the person will, and how pastors will be supervised, and how they will be reviewed annually, but not a list of tasks that they do. That belongs in their job description, and it's in the policy manual. The reason for that is if you are in a season where you need your pastor to be doing different things because, hey, we're having a pandemic, then you don't want to have in your bylaws that a pastor does certain things that can't be done during a pandemic. But if they're in their job description, then you can work on that with personnel and with your board without having to change your rules. So in essence, you want guidelines here that are overall systemically true, but not nitty-gritty. You want the search process in broad strokes, which means in the occasion of a pastoral vacancy, we will call a regional minister to act as a consultant. You should hopefully not put in there, and the search committee will be the chair of this, the chair of that, the chair of this, and the one person from women's ministries. You don't want to do that, even though it's in a lot of your rules. And the idea is, well, these people are the ones who are really in the know. The problem with that is these may not be the best people for this task. And being on a search committee is a weekly obligation for multiple months. And so you asking the busiest people to do another busy thing. You also want to balance your search committees with half people that are from before the current pastor and half people who came during the current pastor time, so that you have a balance of perspective. And if you have it by office, you usually have the old guard only on the search committee and not your newer members, who then don't have an investment in the choice at the same way and often will leave. So you need to think about that when you name that committee. And I would say in there that your search committee will be between 5 and 7 people and will work with the regional staff. And the regional staff will work differently because every year or two that process changes. And so I don't want to codify it with this is what the region will do, because that process is also evolving as time goes on. And one of the first tasks I have in almost every search is to go to the documents and say, before we can do this, we need to decide if we're going to do this process or if we're going to change your bylaws first. And so 8 out of 10 times a governing document review happens in a search process time because it needs to in order to complete a search in a healthy way. You want ideas with a little more detail than your Constitution gave about how a pastor comes and goes. But again, the real nuts and bolts of that will be somewhere else. You want a committee structure outline, but so you might say we have these 3 committees who assign work as to task forces. You want to make sure that you look at a committee structure that fits who you are in this time and size. And I do have another slideshow on how to choose a committee structure, which I'd be happy to share on opportunities with any of you who'd like to look at different ways to do committee structure. You want to name a nominating committee formation, which should basically be something like the nominating committee is in the such and such quarter of the year, a nominating committee is appointed to bring a slate of nominees to the board meeting before the congregational meeting. Again, no dates on it, but that the board nominates the nominating committee, who then brings a slate to the board and then to the congregation. And then you want to add how do you change the bylaws? You change the bylaws usually with a 3/4 quorum of the board that has notification and has at least 1 or 2 weeks notice of when the meeting is and what is the current policy or the current document and what change are you proposing? And my favorite, why? Why are you proposing that? And where the proposal comes from. So those are bylaws. We suggest that you have a book of policy documents. Then you have policies for things that are in congruence and jive with your governing documents. And one of those is current job descriptions for all staff, including how are they evaluated, on what schedule, and what are your expectations that they continually educate themselves for work, and what is that expectation? Anybody who's worked in a teaching profession or medical profession knows that you have a certain number of hours a year of education you need to do to keep your self current. And so in the job description, often we say, what kind of structure will you put around that? How will the congregation help to pay to make that possible? Or if it's not a value, it doesn't need to be there. But if it is, it should be in the job description. You're well served to have a long range vision document in your bylaws. Whatever is the last time you did visioning should be not in your bylaws, it should be in your policy documents, so that you have in there record of long-range visioning you have done. This is a notebook that it would be really helpful for you to make if you don't have this notebook. What are the specific duties of the officers? That's where you get to say the officers do these things. And that is because you may need that to change. And in order to change policies, you really just need the board to change the policies. You don't have to go through all the changing your legal documents, which is why you want things in here that you don't want to have to do all that rigmarole. But also these things were not change your denominational affiliation or raid your assets. So that's why they can be more fluid. How do you call a congregational meeting if you need one? And what are the details on meeting schedules? So you may say the property committee meets a minimum of 4 times a year for these reasons. You can meet every month if you want to, but don't put that's what you're doing, because most committees don't need to do that. With the reason that a lot of our documents have all that stuff in them is we didn't have the internet and we didn't have Zoom. We had to get in our cars and drive to a building to be in a room together and drink fairly weak coffee together in order to do business. We don't need to do that anymore. And so we don't have volunteers who want to do that as much. So we want to make our structures fit the technologies we now have available. Okay, Kathy, well, my congregation doesn't Zoom and doesn't know how to do that. That's okay. They don't have to. And at the same time, most volunteers no longer want to go to monthly things. If they want to go to monthly things, it's because they like hanging out together. So hang out together. That's great. But don't necessarily need to make your governance the only place for community. You have Bible study for that. You have fellowship groups for that. You have knitting groups for that. You have all sorts of ways to be together. But governance was a high value of generations mine and above mine, loved their church governance meetings and felt really included by doing them. People younger than me, and I'm 60, whatever I am, they're not as interested in governance and they don't want to go to all these meetings. And so what we hear is these people don't care about the church. Yeah, they do. They just don't like to go to meetings like that. So find other ways to use them. So in your policies, you would also have details on social media, web streaming, and video usage. You want to have that because you don't want everybody in the congregation to put whatever they want to on your media. You want control over what goes on your media. This speaks to you, to the rest of the world, literally the whole world. We have people who follow the regional stuff from Africa. And, you want to, so for instance, the regional policy is nothing is on that. No, we don't announce events there that are not regional events, because with 45 congregations, all we would be is a bulletin board for events that none of you are going to go to each other's events because you're not going to drive all those miles during COVID. So, but we will put celebrations of congregations in other places. So we have a policy of what we can stream and what we can't and who can speak for us. Which brings me to this one. You also need to have a building use policy. Who can use your building and how? They cannot be a for-profit thing. They can't charge admission to their events unless that money is going to the congregation. And you can't launder money. You can't collect money for an event and then you pay it out. You're not a money laundering institution. Also, a child protective policy and processes by which you will adjudicate any accusation of abuse. You would like an investment policy. What do we do with monies that you want to say, this is how we can and cannot invest money? And then how do we count our money, deposit our money, write our checks? Basic fiscal responsibility. If you receive a bequest, what do you do with that? And who adjudicates that? If you do have a boundary crossing, what do you do about that? And also a minister who is no longer there, there's a code of ethics that covers that, but sometimes it helps to have it written down somewhere. Also, how do you choose a minister emeritus or an elder emeritus would be in your policy documents. For all of these policies, I have samples in my files. Personnel policies, this is a big one. You need to know how you evaluate and how there's a grievance policy. It is important to have a personnel policy. How do sick days get accrued? How is vacation adjudicated? All of that needs to be in your personnel manual, and we have samples of that as well. It is important that it is reviewed frequently. And you want to have job descriptions for the committees so that committees know what is and isn't their work. You want to know how to appoint members to committees between elections. And here's an important one: how long to retain records, what kind of records, and where are they? That's important, because you need to be able to know, how long do we need to keep all these newsletters, and what do we do with them, and board minutes and policy manuals, and. You need a family leave policy that could be in your personnel document, or sometimes it's separate. We have recommendations for that. A sabbatical policy: when a sabbatical happens, what is the process for that? Should be either in your personnel manual, or it might be separate. Who can speak to you? When there was an embezzlement from Portland First Christian, luckily, they had a policy that said only this one person can speak to the media, which allowed everybody else to say, we're not talking to the media, don't, and reminded them not to. And it helped to keep the congregation intact. And even though they had that embezzlement that was public all over the news, they lost 2 families over that. And that was very, very controversial. But because they had guardrails, they had process, they had policies in place, those are what really saved them in that time. The statement about an annual review of the statement about either how often you're going to do the policy manual. And I think that all policies should be reviewed in 5 years or less, but they each need different amounts of review, and you can judge that by your congregation. You need a policy for amending policies, which I suggest to be 50 to 75% of a board meeting. You don't need to pull the congregation together. If it is a very controversial issue, you would be wise to do that, but you don't need to take everything to the congregation. That's why they elected people. That's why they hired people. And finally, you want to make sure that your policies are backed up in computers and hard copies. You want to have copies in the office. You want to have them in notebooks that every board member has, and it's kept up to date. If you have a website, you can do that, where you can put all your information in a place that isn't public, but is accessible by your board. And you keep everything there. I suggest you keep it in computer, on memory devices, hard copy in your office, and with all your members, with everything dated, so that you know which generation of that policy. When you change a policy, you often say this was adopted this date. It supersedes the policy of this, this, and this. So you keep a chain of policies. And if you do not have this now, we can help you recreate it, or you could start now. And very important, you need a conflict of interest, because you need to know, if you are receiving bids for something, is it okay to have bids from the congregation? Is it okay for somebody who is a staff member to bid on a contract for extra income? Where are those lines, and where will you put them, so that you don't have somebody say, well, we hired this church member to do this, but now people are mad that we didn't bid it out. You need to have a plan for that. So where do we go from here? Here are the decisions I want you to think about. Do you, having heard this, need to amend your documents? You have documents that are close enough, but that could use some updating. Or do you need to start over and do replacement documents? I could argue either one. Usually after seeing your documents, I can tell you which is better for you. If it's massive changing, if you have everything in one document, you're going to need to do new documents. You're not going to be able to amend yourself from 1 to 3. That's too confusing for people. And so when you do amendments, it doesn't really help very much if you put all that language, you put both the old and the new in the document, with one of these editing programs. That confuses people no end. What you are better off doing is sending them the new document with the amendments in it, and then a sheet that says, here is everything we changed and why, so that they can have that, and they can look at the document without trying to figure out, is it red or green or what? I don't know. We did it that way for years, but it was very confusing. People really like just knowing what are we changing, and that way they can just read that part of the document and have the whole thing. What is the project timeline for you, and what is the most urgent task? You may not need, you can look at this list of things and think, what is the one that's on fire for us right now? And what I usually ask people to do is make a list of, these are the things we need to do right away. These are the things that would be good to work on. These things can wait a while. So you don't think you have to do all of this at one time, because please don't, it's too confusing. Who will do this work? Usually a separate committee will do it, or you may have different committees do different pieces of it. Worked with a congregation recently which had a constitution team that met, and then they gave their work to the bylaws committee to work on, and the bylaws, and those were adopted by the board, and then they divided the policy work out among different people and different committees did different policies based on interest. And it wasn't just the board, they called in lots of different people. So who's going to do the work? And this is something that gets sideways all the time, because if you tell a story twice in a church, it's true, even if it isn't. And so you want to be over the top communicating with what's happening. So if you have a committee, every single time the committee meets, you report into the newsletter, the committee met and they reviewed a policy on this. These are the major issues they're discussing. Don't keep secrets. And the other thing is, if you do this work for 6 months and then you show up with a product and you're really invested in it and you love it, all these people have process deficit. They didn't go on that list. And every question you had answered, they didn't have answered. So you want to report every single time you make a meeting or a choice, what you did and what you're going to do next, just like if you're doing a search process. And where will you get the information to help you work on each of these tasks? You need to start thinking about that. Are there parts of this for which you need a lawyer? Sometimes you need a lawyer for some of this and sometimes you don't. We can help you assess when that is. You might want to ask who knows about certain things in our congregation, who might know something from their job or their experience. And what's different about our congregation that makes some of the things that Kathy was talking about just not apply to us? What is unique and what isn't covered in this? How are we different? And here's how we can help you. Your regional ministers can meet with your governing document working committees. You can get resources from a congregation that's like you, especially if they're like you, but you can't just adopt somebody else's bylaws or constitution, because you are not the same as they are, because you're disciples. And also you're not the same in your community, may have different norms. Your congregation can't adopt the same number of elders as another one necessarily. In the past, you could just get the boilerplate from the denomination and just everybody adopt that. Those days have been gone for about 20 years. A very wonderful resource is a church law and tax report. There is a cost involved, but they do also have free podcasts that we can send you on different topics. We can help you one piece at a time. We can say, we want to have a policy on building use. And we can say, you know who has a really good one is this church. Why don't you talk to them? We don't always have to be the person, but we may know the person. And if you do need to seek legal counsel, we can help you with that. This is my name. This is my phone number. This is my email. And you can watch our website and our Facebook page for updates on this topic and on many others.